Okay, so time to get on with the show. The panel discussion is going to be moderated by our chair, Dr. Dan Whalen. Dan is a Caltech guy. He got his bachelor's degree in engineering from Caltech, his master's and PhD in computer science from Caltech. He was chief technology officer at FileNet and did such a great job there that their company was acquired by IBM, and so he became an IBMer and has retired and now has his own consulting practice. And I will turn the proceedings over to Dan.
Thank you, Michael. I certainly can't take credit for FileNet's success in that sense, but nor would I want to. But thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to our meeting on DevOps. I'm going to spend a few minutes here and get the charts up. I'm going to talk about, I'll give you a few introductory comments. I'll introduce our panelists, and they're each going to give a presentation. So this is our first panel format meeting that we've had in a couple of years. So we're trying this, and I think it's going to be a great meeting. But the format is basically going to be that after I introduce the panelists, each panelist will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then following all three talks, we'll have a moderated Q&A session. So some of you have submitted questions online. Thank you for doing so. We appreciate that. And then after we get through the moderated Q&A, which will probably be around 8:20 ideally, we'll open it up for an open Q&A. We'll have runners with microphones enabling you guys to ask questions from the floor. So that's the way we're going to do it, and just hold on, it'll be fun. So I'm going to say a few comments just to set the stage here about DevOps. It's a relatively new field to me. These guys here are all very experienced in it, as you'll learn. So what is DevOps? Well, first of all, it's a relatively recent term. It was coined in 2008 at an Agile conference in Toronto by Andrew Schaefer and Patrick Dubois. If you go look at the source of all facts, Wikipedia, you'll get a definition here. So it's certainly a software engineering practice that combines development and operations. It depends upon automation and monitoring. And it's basically designed to and intended to speed up the development process and allow you to increase development frequency. So we'll hear more about that tonight. There's another field, another term you're going to hear about as well, which is site reliability engineering, which is a Google coined term. And it's actually a practice that Google initiated probably sometime in the mid 2000, like 2005 timeframe, I think, or so. I know it probably dates back to Genesis around 2003 or so, but there's a lot of overlap between site reliability engineering and DevOps, and you can see, at least some of the terminology up here and sort of the view of this. But we'll hear more about that tonight as well. So with that said, I'd like to ask a few questions. So who is doing DevOps? So of you in the audience, how many of you currently have a DevOps practice in your place of employee? Show of hands here. Okay, great, thank you. That helps us understand the audience. So how many of you have tried to establish a DevOps practice and failed or shut down that practice? We got one or two at least, okay? Might be interesting to hear your thoughts during the Q&A as to what happened there. And I guess probably the question for the rest of you is how many of you are interested in establishing a DevOps practice? I assume that's everyone who hasn't raised a hand. So great. So that gives us some insights into the audience. So thank you for sharing that with us. With that, I'd like to turn over and start talking about our panelists. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel here. So I'm going to do this alphabetically. So our first panelist I'm going to introduce is Sanjay Maru. Sanjay currently leads the Enterprise Architecture Group at St. Joseph Health, and he's responsible for technology transformation and strategy. He has spoken on DevOps at a number of venues, including HIMSS 2017, which is a
Health IT.
A health information management conference, I assume. and at a vendor conference, PuppetConf 2016. He's an IT leader with 20-plus years of experience, although he looks so young. Is successfully delivering solutions aligned to business strategies and goals. And prior to working at St. Joseph Health, he worked at Nationwide. He filled various roles from leading development teams and enterprise architects to establishing and implementing enterprise technology strategy. Our next panelist is Steve Mason. Steve Mason is currently a program director at IBM in Costa Mesa, where his responsibilities include DevOps for IBM's enterprise content management, SaaS, and box relay product offering. He has also spoken about DevOps at an IBM Wardle Watson 2016 conference, and has nearly 30 years of experience managing and developing enterprise content management and business process management software at IBM and FileNet Corporation. Yes, we crossed paths for many years. So Steve earned his bachelor's in computer science from Cal Poly Pomona. And our third panelist is Marc Tamsky. I assume I have your bio here someplace, Mark. Guess what? I don't. So, odd. So, I'll do this from my memory. So, Mark has a wealth of experience in this field. He's worked at Google as a site reliability engineer in their SRE practice back in, the 2005 timeframe? 2007 timeframe. Worked there for a number of years, has worked at a couple of startups since. He's now, as you heard earlier, at Veritone, where he's vice president and responsible for systems reliability engineering. That includes DevOps practice at Veritone. So he's going to speak from a wealth of experience at both Google and at other companies here. So please, join me in welcoming our three panelists. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Mark to make his introductory comments. Hit the forward button there. Thanks.
So I almost got a bachelor's, but not like. So I studied computer science and almost got a bachelor's in UC Santa Barbara. And I got my start using Unix systems there. It was around 92 when Linux came out, and everyone could suddenly become a Unix system administrator. And so I was interested, and I started toying around with it, and found I was pretty good. And I did that for almost 20 years, and I built a lot of stuff and built monitoring and audited things and wrote documentation and all the DevOps-y kind of things you hear about. But I found myself at Google and learning this stuff kind of with new, fresh eyes. And it was site reliability engineering crystallized into a particular practice. I found that what I'd been doing for 20 years could be done a lot better, and you can apply a lot of process to it, and understand and measure and make incremental change a lot easier to understand. After all, they're Google. They're pretty good with uptime and things like that. So that was my first realization that I could be doing this stuff a lot better. And the second was that the way that SRE interacted with the rest of the business, with developers and with the product team that was building or planning to build features, was different than what I'd been seeing the past 20 years of my career as a Unix admin. It was totally different. And so this was what I was used to, right? I was used to a world where developers made stuff and the operations team had to run it. There was no choice really in the matter. I was used to a world where developers could commit something to production and pretty much late on a Friday and go home and leave it to everyone else on the ops team to clean it up. So, the thing that was really important, made very important in the SRE world was cost. These things have a cost. When something breaks and catches fire, people spend time fixing it, and that has a cost. Unless these costs are borne by the people that they affect, or where they come from, I should say, these types of actions continue. Right? It's about having a good feedback system for costs, and I think that's a lot about what DevOps does, and a lot about what SRE do, is create organizational positive feedback loops, so that costs can be exposed to the rest of the business. So I think, Dan, you already kind of outlined some of these things in the introduction. It kind of feels like revisiting it here for this panel, that it was there was no good solid definition of DevOps, and it kind of felt like it was a menu of choices. And there's no place you can go and get DevOps certification for your organization. It's like 9001 ISO. But I think it all starts from the premise that developers are good at developing software, and we believe that that's true, and we know that the operations side is good at operations, so if we work together, we can probably move faster. So this was kind of the outline that you'd set up. I stole this off the web somewhere. The unstated goal here is that we're trying to decrease risk when we make change and increase the velocity of change. So, but it's not really clear how to get there, right? That's the goal. How do you measure it, and how do you get there? Kind of nebulous. This is my biggest takeaway from SRE, which was that you can measure these things, right? That you can have a rigorous engineering discipline applied to the practice of running an enterprise system. And these are the kind of metrics that matter. So as you can probably imagine, I'm partial to the SRE model, and I'm going to espouse it here. So the responsibilities are pretty clearly laid out, the lines in the sand, and there's a good book. I think you have it over here, the Site Reliability Engineering book.
I'm right here.
Yeah, this is also available online for free. You can just Google SRE book. It's the first result. There's no way to cover that whole book in a few minutes, but these are some of the takeaways that I found to be the most important. If you look at the list, it boils down to, if you can measure it, then you can probably improve it. The other big takeaway was hope is not a plan. That's kind of a mantra within SRE. It applies to software development, and it applies to operations. A lot of businesses run with it. They have a disaster recovery plan written down somewhere, but it's never been executed. Everyone's afraid to probably run it. The things that scare you the most are probably the things you probably should spend the most time, or spend at least enough time to get there so that you can actually do those things. Actually executing a disaster plan was something that they did often at Google. And they improved it each time. Right? They identified the slow choke points, and they would revise and iterate. They would run, there's a whole chapter on disaster planning and scenarios. So I found it to be fascinating. I think the other distinction between the code that might have been written in the early days of the web and what needs to be written now is that we're all writing for distributed systems. And distributed systems have failures and delays and things that when you run a single node piece of software, don't exist. And it's a discipline that isn't necessarily the forefront of software engineering. I'm sorry. The second point was that there was a piece of that there was a budget for SRE support, and everyone wanted in SRE in Google, they wanted SRE support because that meant the SREs would carry the pager for their service, and they wouldn't get woken up in the middle of the night. It also meant that there was a certain level of standard that was being met in order for us, the SRE team, to accept the pager. So this was kind of a carrot and stick model. We agree to take the pager, but you agree to at least make your service at least this good, and we'll talk to you. And since everyone wanted it, and they knew where the bar was, most software that wanted it was built to that level, and it improved the software throughout the organization to choose things that were supportable from the get-go. So, choosing from a menu of supportable services. So, how am I doing on time?
Fine.
So the way that people would get started talking to the SRE team when they were ready is during design, hopefully. That was our point of contact before software was written. We would make sure that it had a sane, logical flow. There was an actual full audit outline that was followed and revised over time, but it was a rigorous audit practice. The other piece that I also mentioned was the platform, right? So SRE provided a list of approved services that you could use. You couldn't use that thing that was good 2 years ago. You'd have to make sure you're using the latest thing. The enabler for all this, I think, was self-service. Developers could run any piece of software themselves. They didn't need to ask a team to set up monitoring or start their service. Developers had, basically, if there was quota available in a data center, you could run a job. It was, on an as-available basis. So disintermediating the asking ops to do things for you was, I think, a key enabler for product velocity there. In conclusion, this was kind of one of my biggest takeaways from the experience. I've been through a lot of organizations where there isn't one responsible party for maintaining what already exists and keeping it stable. The business need wants to make things better, and change things, and add features and remove features, and developers just want to get software written and deliver it, but there's not necessarily a party that's empowered to stop change from happening if it's identified as something that will compromise the existing runtime. I think that was one of the key enablers of the SRE story. So, thanks.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to move over to Sanjay. He's going to talk about his experiences at St. Joseph Health.
So, hi, everybody. I know Dan had everybody raise some hands up, but I wanted to find out anybody in healthcare. Quite a few. Anybody familiar with healthcare IT landscape? A little bit more. So I think there are a fair amount of you that probably aren't, but let me just give a brief overview of St. Joseph Health. It's a health system where we have 16 different hospitals, 300 plus clinics, and some of those clinics are just mom and pop shop to all the way pretty close to a small hospital. We have 15,000 caregivers, clinicians that provide the service, close to 41,000 licensed beds, not only in hospital, throughout our systems. And in terms of finances, we provided $441 million dollars worth of services to community. And we tend to look at being a nonprofit organization, what amount of services that we provide. And we serve 10 different communities across California, New Mexico, and Texas region. Now, a little bit of background on our IT infrastructure. We have primary 3 data centers spread across Las Vegas, Southern California, and Texas. This is the point that I wanted to kind of get everybody familiar with, which was because it was a shock to me when I kind of joined, knowing, working in multiple verticals and stuff. You tend to think, okay, at the most, I'm dealing with 50 different types of applications and so on and so forth. In healthcare, in just our system, you catalog of 1,500 plus applications. Now, another unique thing is if I just consolidate this and uniquely look at each applications, probably still 700 odd applications that we want to keep running, have it available 24/7 without downtime, and so on and so forth, because it's on most of the cases, it's a life and death situation, right? When you're serving patients all throughout. The team that does our operation is no more than 118 people. 6,000 plus physical servers, 9,000 plus virtual servers. Why physical and virtual combination? Well, some of the applications that were inherited or came in acquisitions and so on and so forth had already physical infrastructure, and then rest of them that were developed or were in virtualized environment were consolidated into our VM environments. We currently, I think this data is a little bit older, but at last check, maybe 6 months to beginning of the year, we had 12 petabytes worth of storage and growing. You never ever archive anything in healthcare. A lot of people use regulation as an excuse not to archive. So we have multiple applications that are still running in read-only mode, but they're still running. And we have 1,500 plus network and switches devices that are running our infrastructure. Point-to-point connection to all sites, all the way to our data center, and egress points at various different locations. So this is kind of a scope. When we started off our journey, wanted to create an IT strategy and architectural roadmap that kind of divided our segments into end-user computing, to hybrid infrastructure, to regional cloud methodologies. How do we deliver our applications to physicians in much more consistent manner, in faster manner? How do we manage various amount of applications? And then there were core infrastructure capabilities behind the scene. So we kind of devised our architectural roadmap pointing on 5 different attributes. Technology efficiency was one of them. Architecting for not just now or solving current issues, but for future as well. Work productivity was another aspect. As many of you may know, healthcare is not inexpensive, double negative, but it is very expensive. And how do we keep costs down while providing the same level or growing level of services is another area that we were looking at. Business IT services, how do we provide ongoing innovations of applications and applicability of computing powers in day-to-day innovations that happens in healthcare. And then visibility and transparency to the business. So when somebody talks about provisioning resources and stuff, sometimes it takes a lot of time before you get your hands on the resources that you requested. And when you do that, think of it, when you order something in Amazon, Amazon confirms it but never talks to you back until I don't know what time the package arrives. You wouldn't like that, right? In this era, even in business, we are asked to deliver same level of service. Where is my request? How is it progressing? What is the ETA? When will I get this in my hand? So those are some of the driving factors that we kind of focused our strategy on. And Dan wanted me to kind of touch base on, we are ITIL shop, so we do a lot of ITIL framework and ITSM processes that kind of delivers different services, but how does ITIL and DevOps work together? So some of the things, like I just try to simplify. ITIL is more of a framework of how it works. You define your service design, you do your service transition, and then you do service operations. That's more of a simplified manner of delivering service. But as an organization, IT organization, we do a lot of catalog-based ITSM delivery of services. And as I mentioned, some of the examples of services, business services, personal computing, central services, and many more. So in this aspect of DevOps, I would say we focused more on our infrastructure services and kind of applied our DevOps thought process to that. And looking at our infrastructure landscape, we divided this in the order that we deliver this service in, right? We have physical infrastructure, network, virtual network, and then you set your hypervisor, storage, and virtual server on top of it. And you have operating layers, operating system layer, any middleware that you might require, any of your security configurations, and then you get application-specific configurations on the servers. And then you hand that off to application vendors, where in healthcare, majority of the applications are vendor-driven. And so there's a lot less number of integration or in-house development that happens. It happens, but it's very marginal compared to any other industry. So that was the first thing in infrastructure, and reviewing this layered approach of our infrastructure. What is the level of application and automation and DevOps that we wanted to do? So to help us define that, we kind of broke down DevOps objectives in small, understandable, business understandable terms. First was the service infrastructure service that we wanted to provide needed to be menu-based. We did that not just by saying, oh, okay, tomorrow onwards is going to be a menu-based service. We looked at our landscape, did a whole bunch of analysis of the data, and found out that we started off with 18 different flavors of virtual servers that we wanted to offer, from minimal to most advanced computing power resources. And when we started doing analysis after defining our base levels, we could fit all of our infrastructure in less than 3 configurations. So think of that from that perspective. That told us a couple of other things. Either we were kind of standardizing a lot manually, or we are over-provisioning a lot. When you need a smallest server and it comes with 8 core, when you only need 2 cores, you're wasting a lot of resources as well. So that was another driving factor that we wanted to address technically. Security is another concern. Another thing was quality. When we deliver systems and then you do ongoing configuration management or upkeep of your security patches and so on and so forth, and to make sure that those changes did not impact the production environment. And how do you do that? You apply your best practices from dev, test, prod environments where applicable. And we wanted to bake in some of the future capabilities of business recovery or disaster recovery into business continuity or disaster recovery into our processes also. And wanted to do zero-touch provisioning. We didn't want any administrator or rack and stack kind of staff going through the process. And wanted to establish existing SLAs. This is where we would drive business value. Of when you Marc talked about you meet my standards, then I will oversee your services. I'll take the responsibility. Similarly, we want to establish infrastructure. If you follow our standards, if it is going to be DevOps ready and provision, you not only get security, DR, quality improvements, faster delivery, but you get nice SLA that we can maintain with you on an ongoing basis. So to deliver the services, we then took a next step of looking at our landscape and said, what are we going to try to put it in our DevOps mechanism? In automated provisioning side, let me tell you a story, and this is more of generalized story. When we would get a request for new resources, it would obviously start off with some business requirement, where some doctor went to a conference and wanted to have this new tool or gadget deployed in our environment. And definitely get going, they wanted it tomorrow. And they wanted it working so that it exchanges data across the systems. All well and good. When the viability of financial as well as business applicability was approved through our IT committee, we would get the request and would see whether we have a built-in capacity for a lot of those tools. If we did, we would start working on a provisioning cycle, which was completely manual. And it had a lot of human touches, a lot of customized configuration, security configuration, a lot of repetitive tasks. We wanted to get rid of all of it, and that's where we use a lot of automation in provisioning. And that's where we kind of looked at two different landscape of tools that were available, and we acquired a lot of VMware's tools, like we realized automation and operations to get our automation in place. And then once we provision those resources, how do we continuously monitor it? How do we continuously make sure that, if somebody, because we wanted to hand this over to vendors who would install their softwares and servers, if they by having access could change any settings that impacted our service layers and stuff, wanted continuous monitoring and auditing. And we put in place through our DevOps systems where if somebody changed the setting that was against the base setting that they shouldn't, the system would automatically recognize it, go back and switch it back to the original content and notify some of the key operations people so that they can get in touch and proactively address what vendors' needs were. So that was another part of a configuration configuration automation that we took on and achieved through DevOps methodology. Third thing was configuration management, ongoing upkeep, your changes of your security profile, and such configuration. How do you deploy them, and how do you manage those? And that, as you can see, the automation and provisioning had a different tool set that achieved that. And on configuration side, tool set responsibility changed a little based on the need. So in reality, DevOps was like many of my panelists would mention a well-defined set of guidelines, but you need to apply that to the business case that you're trying to solve. And in our case, it was very helpful to have a nice business story, a nice business objective to anchor all of this too. And that helped us roll out our DevOps program in faster manner, in much more successful manner, and show business results right away. And some of the things that we learned, lessons and consideration that I would like to kind of share with people who are considering DevOps or are continuing to deploy their DevOps or are well entrenched in DevOps practices, right? People, and you'll probably hear it from all of us, there aren't many people available who know DevOps. There's no certification or tool set available that you can pick and choose and say, hey, I'll pay top dollar to acquire that talent. Second, skills. People do, so you need to analyze what type of DevOps skills, what problem are you trying to solve, and what kind of skills do you need? In our case scenario, we didn't want anybody to be a super duper software engineer. Somebody who was very good at automation or thinking in those manners, would love to automate their regular tasks, hated doing repetitive tasks in operations area. Somebody was very well versed or was comfortable doing scripting and stuff, a perfect resource. We identified those kind of resources as our initial batch of people that we trained. And training was more available based on tools and technologies that we had. We had consulting partners that came in for specific business cases or use cases that we wanted to implement. We didn't throw our primary team into deep end by saying, hey, here's the tool set, boom, automate it and use DevOps as best. We brought nice professional help from vendors' perspective to get our DevOps engine started. While they were doing it, we wanted to make sure that our in-house team was getting trained, getting comfortable, and next revs, they were contributing to the deployment of our DevOps practices. So that was another lesson learned that we kind of threw in. From process perspective, how are you going to transition from your traditional processes to DevOps? It's not a flipping a switch. And so you need to think through how you're going to transition it. We used app rationalization as a process of whether we would follow old or a new DevOps process. And we kind of upfront during discussions with the technical team or solutions team identified what would make it and how can we help them have their app up to the standard so that we can deploy it and give them the benefits of our newly automated fast provisioning system. And then client impact. What does it cost? From get-go, we knew that question would come in, that people previously didn't care that in our environment, how much does a server or a blade or a chassis cost? It was free to them because we absorb all the costs. Wanted to start educating because there was a lot of over-provisioning happening because they didn't get financially, dinged for it. And so we wanted to not say no, but at the same time start educating our business community as to cost of each and every resources that you deploy and how do we stop resource provisioning. And I'll give you a quick highlight of what we achieved in first years. I took data from last couple of years before DevOps and found out that by just deploying DevOps in certain practices, we saved 50% in over-provisioning cost of our resources. They were sitting there, and I was amazed when I did that. I had a couple of my technical people chime in, double-check my data, and then brought this about. And that wasn't the driving force of reducing cost or not provisioning enough. This was just a byproduct. So client impact is another area that one should consider, show benefits, financial if possible. That will give you a lot of traction and a lot of leeway in deploying your DevOps practices. Third thing is selection of technology. Identification, evaluation, and selection. What we did in our case was as I go back a few slides back, we had our business problem defined. And that helped us do a proper evaluation of selection of technology. You saw Puppet over there, but when we initially kind of did the training, we were considering Chef or Puppet. They both have similar capabilities of configuration management and so on and so forth. But what we found was Salt was very powerful from programming perspective. It allowed you to do a lot more, and it was much more flexible. And that will be the choice, preferred choice in long run. We opted for Puppet because it allowed us to get going with what resources we had and the time frame that we wanted to deploy our technologies in. And that allowed the quick bootstrap time. And it still opened up our capability to transition our Puppet code into Chef code if we choose to in future. So we weren't pigeonholed. But that's those are some of the things that helped us kind of move forward in our technology selections in DevOps journey. That I'd like to transition to.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna take you through our journey here at IBM. I wish I could say it was all planned. Sanjay had some great goals up front. Ours was a little bit more survival, and then about halfway through, we kind of figured out what some of the goals were, and then drove through it. So this chart that I'm showing you here really came about halfway through our journey. So as I start to detail it, I'll let you know when we started to get clarity and when we started to realize we had some problems, and DevOps was going to help us solve those problems. So with this chart, what we're really trying to show is we wanted to increase the velocity of being able to have that aha moment, an idea, being able to deliver it to a client. And when you have a development team, they're paid, they're focused on developing features. You have an operations team, they're paid to keep the service running, have resiliency. You really have somewhat of opposing goals. And so we had some blockages in getting from that aha to the value, and then getting the feedback back to the team such that we could then deliver again. So really, if you think about DevOps, it's really about increasing the velocity. When you then start to look at, okay, now that I understand what I need to solve, you really need to be able to measure it. Take a look at some of these measurements that are up here. You've got service level agreements, you have provisioning and availability, the cost of running the service. Have you heard these guys mentioning these? It's a common theme. One of the keys as you read down them and you think about them, they really span both that development and operations side. You really, if you're going to really measure it, you have to look at it on an end-to-end basis. So you really have to bring these together to be able to measure it and then really know, are you doing it? Are you doing it well? And get into that iterative mode where you measure and you come back. We like to say this, you want to fail fast and then be able to react and come back and adjust. So my background is I started off in software development, worked my way over to the dark side of management, and then I went ahead and I spent time working within our enterprise content management portfolio, leading a lot of what we were doing there from the development aspect. I decided to go take a short stint over on the business side and understand, well, how do we do our product management and how do we actually manage the business side of software development? And then I came back and then I was doing operations and then back into development. So I spent a little bit of time wandering around and learning quite a bit about the different facets. I want to highlight that there was 3 major inflection points on our journey. We started off where we were doing on-premises software development. We did that for a long time, did it really well. Our release cadence was on that year to 18 months. So you know how that goes. We implemented agile practices. Dan could tell you quite a bit about a lot of that as he drove a lot of our agile and a lot of our technology. Once we had, you have to be adaptive. You know that technology changes. You know that the market changes. You know that techniques change. Now the big inflection point there was moving into developing something for the cloud. Delivering a service that we wanted to have, and that was the IBM Navigator on cloud. So the first was our enterprise content management software. Second was we wanted to deliver enterprise content management as software as a service. We did that for a while. The business decided we made some changes in the business. We then partnered with Box. How many of you have heard of Box as a cloud-based enterprise? Yeah, Joe, Quinn, you guys should raise your hand. You work on it. So we partnered with Box to bring the power that IBM has with our knowledge of workflow over to Box's collaborative content management. And the next two points that I have there on our journey is where we developed and delivered the service, ran it as an alpha, moved our way into a beta, and then the next inflection point is general availability. I really like Matthew Skelton's DevOps team topologies. I think what it shows you is it isn't going to be one size fits all when it comes to DevOps. He's identified some anti-patterns. He's also identified some patterns. So I'm going to use this as I go through these inflection points of where did we find ourselves on this journey and where did we then decide we needed to move to. I'll also highlight as we go through the journey what were some of the challenges and what were some of the takeaways that we learned and some of the the gains that we had and some of the failures that we had as well. So you saw on-prem, IBM Navigator on cloud. So really looking at the type there, we were really an anti-type. We didn't really realize that we really needed ops within development. We were doing development and then we were going to just hand things over to the operations team. With that, it was a bit of a waterfall. We were 100% agile with how we were doing our development and our tests, and we would make sure that, if we were going to say done, it had gone through the process all the way through build and test and delivery. But what we didn't do was actually go and deploy that to a production environment and get that last aspect of done when you bring the ops into it. We also had been given some crazy deadlines, so we went into this with an incredible amount of technical debt. We hit our goals in that we went from the time where our management and our product team had an idea in February of 2014 to where we delivered the service in June. So 4 months to take some on-prem software, deliver it out as software as a service. And so there was an incredible amount of debt that we had amassed. I had mentioned that operations was an afterthought. It was also very difficult and expensive to operate. So what was our focus during this time? Our focus during this time was around taking something where we had a release cadence of a year to 18 months to getting it down to where we shortened it. And we actually shortened it down to where we released about every 3 months. We did releases in June, which was our initial release. We did another release in the late August timeframe. We did another one in December at the end of the year. And then we did another one in the March of the following year timeframe. The unfortunate thing was, once we had some clients, it was single tenant, and once we had clients running on this, we never upgraded them. So we ended up running 4 versions of the service for the different clients. Bit of a disaster operationally, but nonetheless, it was what it was. And we were having success. We took our architecture during that time where, again, it was on-prem, it was installed. It used to take our customers to install this on-prem software anywhere from a month to 6 months from the time that they would provision the software and do all their enterprise integrations and get that software running. We got it down to where we could provision it within a week or 2. So made some significant headway there. We also focused on build and that we knew that we had to get to where we had a much more reliable set of build processes. And when we got towards the end of that journey, we had actually containerized our applications and we're using Docker containers, and our last deployment was Docker containers. So you can see the focus in this part of the journey was all around development. And it was really getting that repeatability into development. The lesson we learned was that we need to focus on operations. So the next part was the Box Relay application. So what ended up happening with IBM Navigator is the Box partnership came along. We decided that we wanted to focus on that. There wasn't really a good business case for what we were doing with IBM Navigator. So we really let that one just kind of die on the vine. We migrated our customers off of it. And then now we got a fresh start. Whew. So with that fresh start, we then started to look at how to reduce that waterfall from the development into the operations and bring that operations into development. We really also knew at that point in time that we needed to reduce technical debt. And so this was really our first start of shifting ops into dev. Where we ended up with this is we still had a separate operations team, in that we knew when we hit production, so this, keep in mind, this is during our development and getting us to alpha and a beta. We knew that when we hit production, we were going to have a separate ops team. So what we did is we brought in some of that DevOps talent into the dev team, and we started to sprinkle that in and start to learn. So we had a team that was within development that was focused on infrastructure integration. We had another team and that was focused on monitoring, how to make sure you monitor. We had managed to distribute the runbooks. Initially, runbooks were created as an afterthought. We then got them into where the development team was starting to produce runbooks as a part of the development. So you can see this ops shift started to happen, and we also increased the velocity of that. An interesting thing happened as part of the operations, in that production operations team never materialized. You heard what Mark said, that it's a commodity that you have to go and pretty much sell yourself to and prove yourself. Well, we were just a starting up service, and it was alpha. So we really didn't have a business case to go and get that team. So look at this third row over here on my left, your right. Those developers turned into operators, which ended up being a blessing. They may not have told you that it was going to be a blessing when it was happening, but I think in hindsight it was truly a blessing, because we had to really learn a new mindset. When we had our service go down and we actually had alpha customers on it, what's the first thing that a developer wants to do? Stop everything, we're going to debug this, and we'll figure out what the problem is, and I'll be able to develop code to fix that. Well, that's really not an operations mindset, is it? An operations mindset is, I'm going to get this thing back up and running, and you can do your forensic analysis later. We're going to restore service, because we don't want the service to be down for our customers. So we learned that, and over the course of that alpha and that beta, we actually learned quite a bit about how to operate. We also learned that the development culture of following your code into production is a very good practice, because it avoids what Mark had described, a developer chucking something over the fence on a Friday, going home and having a great weekend, while the operations team has to go and deal with that over the weekend. We got to deal with the changes that we made. One of the things we implemented was a moratorium on deploying code on Fridays. We're not dumb. So then we get into leading from beta to our GA. And as we were doing that, we came to the realization that a really good model is the Google SRE model. And that is, you have your functional development team that's responsible to develop the functionality. That's what they do it well. And then you have an SRE team that knows how to develop and automate and operate a service, but not doing it in a manual fashion. You want to automate the heck out of this such that there's very little that's going to be manual. So that's the model that we really wanted to adopt and move forward with. And so you can see that's the type here is that smooth collaboration, to where there's a lot of collaboration that's going on between your SRE, your operations team, as well as your development team. But your development team still is going to be on pager duty and get paged out. So when we have an incident, obviously our SRE team is going to jump in there at first. They're going to be looking at the automation, collecting logs. We'll pull our subject matter experts in very quickly. I recommend after this, go have a talk with Joe, with Quinn. You can talk with Anita. They can tell you some of the stories about how they got pulled in and some of the problems that we had to go solve. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but one of the things, in order to get there, you really have to focus on your pipeline, and you have to mature your pipeline such that you develop your code, You actually deliver it in a very production-like manner to development and test. Your test has to be automated, and you then promote that to production. And in our case, we would do that in a dev test. Our production environment was a staging environment we would promote it to, and then from staging, it would go into production. We do our deployments. We got them down to where we do it on a weekly basis. We've had to do very few rollbacks, and that we've had quite a bit of success. We have had quite a bit of learning about what to monitor and what not to monitor, what makes sense, and because we ended up in a situation in our beta where we were getting alert fatigue, and that's where the alerts were going off too frequently, and we were alerting on things that really didn't matter. So you realize very quickly about how to dial that back and how to really alert on what makes sense, and then how to then go in and automate and what makes sense to actually go in and take care of in an automated fashion, and then what do you need actual experts to come in and pay close attention to. But the moral of the story is you can take a look at this continuous delivery maturity model, and you really need to focus on elements of that to really get yourself into a good state when it comes to DevOps. Where to next? Continuously improve. Really look for areas that you can improve. This is not an area that stands still. Technology changes, the tools change. Unlike a lot of the development that we did back in the on-prem days, you could stay rooted on a technology for years. Not so in the case of DevOps. I would ask my partners here, how quickly they see technology moving, and you really can't get married to that. You really need to be agile and move on those technologies. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck, and you'll probably be doing something that isn't beneficial, and it ends up being a pinch point to where you end up not being able to deliver value to your customers. Can't say it enough. Automate, automate, automate. You really want to just automate the heck out of everything. Another benefit of putting developers in an operational role, they don't like to do things manually. They're developers. They like to develop. They'll automate. So if you're looking to start this journey, I recommend start off with some very intelligent developers like we did, and you'll end up with some really good results. And sprinkle that in with some IT folks that have experience with infrastructure and networking, and bring that skill in as well. The next big challenge that we see is around security, and it's bringing security and compliance into develop. That's that DevSecOps. It's doing that same type of a journey, but now bringing in security controls and compliance as a part of when you're thinking about the feature development, because if you try to do it after the fact, doing some of those certifications is really going to be a royal pain, and it becomes very difficult. And there's nothing worse than going back to your product team and tell them, guess what, you're not going to be able to do any features because you need to go and develop compliance and bring compliance in. So that's where we're headed next. With that.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your experiences with our attendees here. At this point, we're going to spend the next part of this meeting having some discussion. And so, again, thank you to the members out here who have submitted questions. So I'm going to jump down to a question that was submitted. The question is, how have you avoided the anti-pattern of having a labeled DevOps, or at least a team of people that are responsible for all the DevOps things? Infrastructure as a code, continuous integration, continuous deployment, and instead drive cultural change across the organization. So which of you would like to start with?
So you heard what I said. We actually implemented the anti-pattern at the very end, right? Which is you really do want an SRE team that is responsible for operations. One of the keys, though, that we found is for every incident, you want to do a causal analysis on it, and you want to then look at how do you prevent that in the future. You want to bring those into your backlog along with your features and your other backlog type items, and make sure that you address them, because you want operations to have a seat at the table when it comes to doing your iterative planning, iteration by iteration. So that's one of the things we did, was causal analysis. And we actually did find that implementing the anti-pattern is, for us, the way to go.
I think in my instance, we were working within operations team and so on and so forth, but our challenges were bringing security up front, all of this. mechanism and integrating that upfront when we were designing our automations or configuration management, proving to them, getting their buy-in. So that's something that kind of took a little bit of cultural shift for us to move into that direction, because SecOps was SecOps. They didn't care about infrastructure ops and so on and so forth, right? So bringing that was something that we had to overcome.
No comment.
Okay.
No,
Well, let me just come back. So when we started off here, we did a kind of a show of hands. Like the vast majority of the audience is interested in implementing DevOps. So let's kind of let me put myself in their seat and say, well, gee, I drink the Kool-Aid. The stuff you guys have been doing has been fantastic. I want to do DevOps tomorrow. Where do I go buy it? Can I buy it? Or do I have to do other things? What I'm hearing is I probably can't just go buy it. Not just tools. But maybe you guys can speak about the sort of set of things that you need to do to be successful. And I know that you've said that it's going to be unique for every organization. But, there must be things, there must be some investments in tooling. There must be some investment in culture, change management. It probably helps to have some executive sponsorship. What are the key things to really help someone who's going off on a DevOps practice be successful? I mean, you each have talked about this a little bit, but do you care to elaborate a little bit more on this?
Want me to go?
Go ahead, Sanjay.
So I'll take this. I think key word that you say is investment, resource needs, consideration of that. But executive kind of rooting for you is a key point. Without that, everything is an uphill battle. And that's one area where we focused in on in our journey is to get executive buy-in, but they don't want to just dump money for the sake of money. We had to come back to the table with how we are going to recoup that money in an investment, how we are going to pay it back from stopping to continuously keep asking for more money as our data grows and stuff, doing things smartly, faster, having them have less calls from our business partners who would be just calling them angry. Angrily as it is 6 weeks and I still don't have my resources. They don't have that problem right now because they bought into our story, but we delivered as well. And once we delivered, then you go back to your continuous improvement cycle and it becomes easier into taking care of your technical debts that you might have to take care of and go back and retrofit those.
I would ask a question. Raise your hand if you started off in more of a waterfall development methodology and then had to move to Agile. It's the same thing. That was not easy, was it? Because it's really a cultural shift. And one of the things that we had with that cultural shift is you'll get resistance, which is why when Sanjay was saying you really need the executive sponsorship and executive backing, I think that's critical. I think the other is recognize that it's a cultural shift and it's going to take time. Therefore, you need to be persistent and recognize that you will likely have failures, because unless you go in and hire some consultant firm that's already done it a zillion times and can help you out, and even then you'll probably fail because no two enterprises are alike, no two solutions are alike, my experience. And so plan to fail, but plan to fail fast, and then plan to then figure out how to pick yourself up, determine what caused the failure, and then move forward with resolving that. We had plenty of failures on our side. I can tell you plenty of times where our developers having to take the pager duty and get paged out, and we're watching this thing. I got a lot of grief. A lot of the development managers and developers were not very happy about that. But then through persisting and just trying to articulate the benefit and commiserating with them, we eventually got to a point where I think they really realized the benefit of it, and they started to be the evangelists of the change and started to help evangelize that.
I think I want to just add a little bit more to kind of highlight that point as well, right? I kept talking about selling this to business and to executives from financial perspective. I think you need to do equal amount of selling internally to people that you're going to transition this to. You're changing their life. You're changing the way they think. And I think you need to keep that in mind and find some of the quick wins. How is it going to make your life easier? And then kind of when it happens, make sure that you go back and say, do you like it? Do you want to do more of it? And, keep encouraging that. It's a 50-50 thing. You need to upsell, but you need to downsell as well. And make sure you bring your team along.
Mark, I'm wondering, you represent the startup here. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, and you've been in a large organization and startups here, is there a significant difference in how you approach, DevOps, some of the value of DevOps, getting the support you need, in a startup versus a large organization?
It's I don't know that it even matters whether you're at a small company or a big company. If you're just getting started in DevOps, it usually means you're starting from a point of maybe not having enough visibility into your infrastructure and knowing what's going on, and that's the thing you need to address. I think that to a T, every organization I've been working at didn't have enough business critical metrics coming out of the software that was being written. And I found that to be the key enabler for being able to operate it. And if you go and ask for it, developers will put in the metrics that you need. And that seems to be like the key link between dev and ops. And it doesn't matter the size of the organization. A lot of companies will say, well, I can see my code's running because I can see the product coming out of it. But the key business functions within your code, how often did they get called? What's the cost of any individual business function? And understanding that is really, I think, a key driver of being able to make all the things, available, reliable, scalable, and visible. Yeah.
So Mark said something earlier that I want to highlight for anyone that's starting out. And he said, if it scares you, you should focus on it and do it. And I think that's really key. Because if something scares you, what's the natural tendency? It's like, oh, we're not going to do that. We'll just leave that for later. Business continuity planning, disaster recovery was a big one that scared the heck out of us. And we went and we tried it out, and guess what? It actually worked. We talked to a sister product in parallel to us, and they had never tried it. And when they got around to doing it and they had a real disaster where they really needed to move, it didn't work. And they actually were down for quite a while. So that's something I think were very good advice. And I'm going to steal that shamelessly, Mark, going forward, because I think it's apropos.
Great. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions before we go to the open Q&A here. So going down the list here, I'm going to one. And it's going to organizations. What are the key organizational challenges you've seen in implementing DevOps? So, Steve, would you like to make a comment there?
A couple organizations. So IBM is a small company, and we move very quickly. As you can imagine, IBM is very large and has somewhat deep silos, and every part of the business at IBM really operates somewhat independently. So one of the things that was a challenge for us is if you found skills somewhere else that you really needed outside of your organization, how do you go get those? One of the best things that happened to us is we had organizational support within our vice president of development at the time, as well as over to the IT part of our business. And we actually transferred over to my team about 8 individuals that had deep IT skills. And we brought them into the development team. Now, this was back over on the IBM Navigator on Cloud when I was over on the ops side, and our development team didn't think they needed any ops skills. So that was a bit of a challenge to then drive that into the team. But organizationally, we had that support to get them. So I'd say the challenge is at IBM could be finding the skills and being able to get them. We did overcome that, though. The other is really finding the support that you need at a high enough level from an executive perspective. IBM has quite a few levels of executive management. You need to go up to the right level. You get that support. Sometimes it's hard to get up to the right level to where you get it to where it's meaningful.
Sure, yeah. So one organizational challenge that I've seen a lot of enterprises have is acquiring headcount for a team whose job it is to build the tools at an organization. So having a common framework that all your apps use for reporting metrics or interacting with a service that might restart it or things like that provide automation and visibility. Doesn't necessarily get top billing for, oh, this probably deserves a team. And it's hard sometimes to get that either built or built and then maintained. But once you have it, you wonder, why didn't we have this before?
Yeah, my experience is that's one of the first things that get cut, is that team that's building those critical tools.
Now, did I misread this when I was looking at the Google book from an SRE perspective? You know, there was stuff in there about management that said we're going to allocate a certain amount of an SRE's time to different tasks and not overburden them in certain ways. And I think, you know, my recollection was like about half that time was supposed to be building tools and programming and coding and automating. And, you know, if you had that, you know, kind of commitment from on the high to say, you know, this team here, which is, you know, going to carry the pager, is also going to spend half their time building tools and automating things to make things better. That seems to be a great enabler for success. But, you know, I'm just reading or reading too much into that.
No, I think that, yeah, if you're spending more than half your time fighting fires, you're probably going to lose that battle.
So there were some really good insights there. So that's going to lead to my next question here, which is, before we go to the open Q&A, you know, where can our audience go to learn more about DevOps? I'm going to turn to Mark.
I'll let you guys go first. I mean, okay. I've already thrown some things out. Yeah, I mean, so there's this book I can highly recommend, SRE book from O'Reilly. There's also even a much more distilled version of this that Ben Traynor kind of published, kind of like the SRE Manifesto. Does a really good job of kind of succinctly giving you the ethos of the organization. And as far as design goes, this is my Bible, the practice of cloud system administration. I was surprised to find it, and it it really codified the engineering best practices that SRE set the bar to in Google, like thou shalt not build singly homed services, right? Everything you build needs to run in multiple data centers, preferably 3, so one can be under maintenance and still have one fail. Those types of rubrics for evaluating the production readiness of a service is really, really great.
Are there consultants out in the space that offer, you know, great advice? Or is everyone just peddling their wares here? And vendors and that kind of stuff. So I'm just wondering, who can, you know, our attendees here turn to? I mean, they can go out and they can pick up some books, they can do some reading, some self-education. Sure, there's plenty of stuff if you Google, but, you know, getting the right stuff is one thing. But who can they go to the next step here?
So for us, I'll take that. From my experience perspective, what we did was we engaged, and like you say, you know, you need to get to the right level in your space, in your executive chain. We had to get to a right level in VMware to get their CTO office person engaged to take us on this journey and make sure that, because they'd worked with other organizations like Apple and stuff, they were doing a lot of upfront work and they already had a cookbook of what not to do or how not to fail in long area. And I think that was, we didn't get much of a time, but whatever we got was well worth the time that we spent with them and money.
So you had a relationship with a vendor, a key vendor that you were able to leverage, and
we still had to push to get negotiate, even fraction of that person's time.
okay. Well, some ideas there. So why don't we open it up to the floor? Do we have some runners with microphones? Because we want to make sure that all your questions are captured. We are video recording. And so please raise your hand and wait for a microphone. The first question, the obligatory first question, is a poll, which goes to Windsor Brown.
Hi.
Hi, Windsor.
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to wake you all up. I'm vice chair for the Orange County Computer Society, IEEE. And just by a show of hands, how many of you happen to be IEEE members? That's nice. 2, 5, 7, 9. Okay, good enough. Thank you.
Well,
the reason we ask is we get support for attendance for IEEE members, and they always look also at the total attendance. So thank you.
So there's some trickle-down economy going on here, so we appreciate that. Thank you for your sponsorship, from the Orange County Computer Society.
Thank you. My name is Michael Ware. I have a question for the three of you. I'm very much involved in Bitcoin. And so I was particularly intrigued by the diagram that you had about security, developers, and the operation. So there's an interesting problem in Bitcoins, and that is security is paramount. So that like I'm signed up for Coinbase, and had some trouble getting money into, let alone trying to get it out. And there's been quite a bit of, so how would you address, so the operational part of it, or the developer part is really the miners who are out mining the Bitcoins, and they have to come to an agreement to any changes. And then there's the security part, and then there's the end user, of which I'm one. So how would you prioritize trying to get this system accelerated?
I think just from a sake of time, maybe we can take one person trying to make an answer on that, because we have probably a lot of people who want to ask questions. So does anyone maybe want to try to address this, maybe kind of divorcing it from the Bitcoin specific nature of it? It's like, here's a domain where you have a strong security need here, and clearly that's going to be a driver in terms of how you make changes organizationally, but does it affect anything that we've talked about here?
So since that was my chart that you're referencing, I can go ahead and take a first stab at it. So when you look at security, there's a bunch of different facets to the security of bringing that into development, right? You have secure engineering, which is, are you doing things in a repeatable manner, and you've got security in your development processes. When you look at how to then implement a secure service, this gets into, you can be looking at it from process, you can be looking at it from controls. From a process perspective, do you have separation of duties such that you don't have someone writing code and then committing it and then they're pushing it out to production? So you want to focus on process to make sure that you have the right processes in place. And you want to do that sooner rather than later, because if you try to come back and put the process after the fact, it's going to be very difficult. The other is you want to have security around the actual architecture of your service. Are you encrypting end to end? Starting at application encryption, and then you're doing it encryption on the wire, and then you're doing encryption at rest. And are you doing it, in a manner that's, industry standard or above? The other thing is, for your operators, have you implemented multi-factor authentication such that you know that you can't be, have vulnerabilities there? So really, it's bringing all of that in after the fact is very difficult. Now, if you have to do that, fine, take your favorite spec, take ISO 27002. It's a great spec for an information security management system. You can go and you can look at that and you can start to parse it and figure out where your vulnerabilities with the application that you're talking about and start to implement those.
Thank you, Steve. Can we get another question?
Hi, I'm wondering what is one of the worst situations that you've had to deal with, from like the point of like absolute freak out to like actually, how did you know that people were experiencing an outage, for example, and then how did you diagnose it, figure out like, hey, something's going on here, and then maybe you're like, we have no idea how to fix this, or we don't know where this is coming from, to like actual resolution. Maybe just for one of you who has like the coolest story. Thanks.
Worst.
Who's got the scars?
Well, I bet all of us have the scars. Well, so I'll share an experience. So how did we figure out we had a problem? Customers started calling us. Bad situation already to start off with. This goes back to, it was our IBM Navigator on cloud days. And what we ended up figuring out was we had some DB2 database corruption, and we had no idea what to do, how to fix it. We went and looked at backups, and we had some backups, and so it was it was a time of really head scratching. It turns out the customer, our most vocal customer, was a logistics customer that was using the offering to go and make sure that they could track everything that was in transit worldwide. And we went dark on them for probably about 4 hours. They came back and told us the cost of that, and it was measured in millions of dollars. So that was my freak out moment. How did we get out of it? We ended up, rebuilding and reconstructing the database. We went and found some experts and got the thing back up and running. But it definitely left scars, and it also highlighted some weaknesses that we had in our architecture that were addressed later. So if you look at our box relay architecture, you won't see that particular database in there, and you'll see redundancy, and you'll see other things that we learned and implemented going forward.
Thank you, Steve.
Hi. I actually wanted to kind of make a premise and wanted to see if you agree with that or not, or what's your perspective. I wanted to say that there are probably some cases where DevOps are more usable and applicable versus some other cases. And the gentleman up front who asked about the blockchain and Bitcoin development, I kind of sense in that question there was developers working under a certain sense of ownership and consensus, that they agree, all aligned with the same goal and kind of with the same drive to deliver some software. Even though they work in a decentralized manner, they probably work in a DevOps model better than some corporate IT organizations. They have a certain structural division, potentially external vendors, internal teams, and the whole corporate organization is actually not supportive of a DevOps operations, and maybe even certain corporate enterprise systems are not even supporting DevOps, where we talk about, let's say, healthcare systems. You have major legacy systems where you cannot just take and replicate a test database, staging database, test2 database, because these are legacy systems potentially been running on an old platforms. So and just to summarize my question, what is your perspective on applicability of DevOps? And if you've seen, or you would say, certain systems or certain development should be potentially not necessarily done in DevOps?
So I'll take that to get, because we face similar situation. We have existing portfolio of applications and stuff, and how do we kind of convert everything? We made a conscious effort to put a process in place, make sure that we app rationalized it. What does that particular term mean? Is it a best fit? what are the parameters of different applications or systems or services that will fit this model. And that can be sustainable, that can be transferable. There are some legacy applications, as you mentioned. Yes, it wouldn't fit that criteria, and those would be the exceptions. Now, we define this 80-20 rule, but you can't take a process and apply 100% to every one of your constituents, right? You'd always want to make sure that there's an exception process, but exception process going forward is a little bit painful. So when new systems or modification or enhancement to the system come in, everybody else gets that service probably in weeks compared to non-standard or legacy or out of requirement kind of boundaries. You would want to go through the whole process that you went through for your defined standards. You'll have to define your DR strategy for each instance and so on and so forth. In itself, it becomes lengthier. I don't want you to go back and say, okay, that's exception, so we will just not worry about it. You still want to go through with it, but make sure that you put enough time, effort, or you highlight that up front. The second thing that what I heard and what I understood is what is the best scenarios and stuff, whether it is distributed teams or corporate IT. I think it works both ways, whether the team is distributed or within corporate IT. If they find, and one key word that you use is if they're disciplined and have same understanding of ethos that you mentioned, that we are going to follow this. Now, distributed team can decide, hey, heck with it, I'm going to go on my own way, and it's not going to be a success. Same applies to corporate IT as well, where you will have a couple of people who are kind of working as passive-aggressive in some nature, then it might not be as successful. So I don't think it's a function of whether team is distributed or corporate IT, it's the principle of things. Does everybody agree on the same principles and same methodologies and make the difference?
I think you can still insert the same idea and practices of, even if it's a legacy system, you can instrument it. You can do that work that lets you be able to decrease the time to recovery if you encounter a failure. I spent time on SRE in acquisitions SRE. So we had things that were legacy systems coming in from an acquisition of a company that we needed to run, and it couldn't run in our data center. Okay, I have none of the Google tooling available to run this. It's in a jail, and we still had to apply our SRE practices to it. We added instrumentation, we added monitoring, we made it alerts, we did all the standard kind of auditable practices that fit within that model, right? We applied what we could. And we sat next to the IT team, the SysOps team, at least at my location, and we shared those kind of best practices as well. They might have been responsible for the IT infrastructure for an office location, all the expected infrastructure, whether it was directory services or authentication. They progressed after I left to a point where they applied this type of discipline to it, and eventually almost kind of got rid of all the services they could that you needed to run an office by putting them in the cloud and getting rid of them and sort of eliminating the boundary of, well, we trust the network inside our building. They've transitioned from, as I hear, from a privileged access model of if you're on the internal network, you get a certain type of access, to your workstation is the element that allows you access, and you could be anywhere. I think they published a paper recently called Access Beyond Corp, and it's basically not providing a VPN anymore. That was the goal.
So I think from a process perspective, just being conscious of time here, I think we'll wrap up the Q&A here. I think the speakers will probably be willing to answer individual questions afterwards here. I would like to take a few moments to thank our three panelists here. We have some certificates here. So, Mark, thank you very much for taking the time out of your personal life here and sharing with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Appreciate that. Sanjay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I hope you all enjoyed the meeting tonight. Found it educational, and hopefully it'll be a sort of a launching board for you in your DevOps practices.